we begin, I'll just tell you kind of how this will be structured. We have 5 questions that we've come up with that each panelist will have roughly up to 5 minutes. We've got to keep it limited at some point. They will each have 5 minutes to answer the one question, and then we'll move through like that. Afterwards, we'll take a brief intermission, we'll stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, whatever, and then following in the second half, we'll be taking questions from the audience that, before the intermission, will pass around the note card, and you can write any questions that you have on there, and we'll use the overwhelming turnout tonight. We have to choose some, and not all, unfortunately, but we'll try and select an even distribution from the audience, and we'll ask the panelists those questions up till, try and get you out of here by 9. That's my end goal. So, with that, we'll begin. We'll start by introducing our panelists here. To my left, I have Dr. Arthur Goldschmidt, who's Professor Emeritus here at Penn State. He taught as Middle East History, Middle East History professor here from 1965 to 2000. He's known for writing a condensed history of the Middle East, first published in Western Press in 1979, and is now being revised for its 9th edition. He has also written many books focusing on Egypt, including the last one, A Brief History of Egypt, published by Facts and Files in 2008. He is editing for the publisher of that series, The Creation of Modern Middle East series. He has led and conducted research in Egypt and several other Middle Eastern countries, thanks to grants from several institutions. He earned his BA from Colby College and his advanced degrees from Harvard University. In retirement, he teaches courses for the Usher Lifelong Learning Institute, Penn State's Elder Hospital, and Institution of Special Studies Program. Next to him, we have Dr. Lawrence Davidson, who is a professor at Westchester in history. He teaches Middle East history and specializes in the history of U.S. Middle East relations. He got his BA from Rutgers, his master's from Georgetown, and a PhD from the University of Alberta, Canada. He is the author of several books, including America's Palestine in 2001, Islamic Fundamentalism in 2003. He co-authored the 8th edition of Concise History of the Middle East with Dr. Goldschmidt, and has a book forthcoming in January called Foreign Policy, Inc., The Privatizing of American National Interests. Lastly, Dr. Robert Packer, as many know. He teaches courses in international relations, focusing on the areas of international political economy, Arab-Israeli conflict, and African politics. He received a PhD from the University of Michigan in 1996, and he was a faculty at both Charleston College in Minnesota and Middlebury College in Vermont. Now he is currently with us here at Penn State, as many of you probably had him in the class. So, please join me in welcoming our panelists and thanking them for being here. We'll begin with the first question. In response to the recent U.S. military raid at Abu Kamal, Syria has closed 2 American institutions. What further implications will this have in regards to ongoing events in the region? I guess we'll start closest to me, or unless somebody is eager to begin.
I was a little bit confused. I actually had to do some research on this one to find out where the 2 American institutions that were closed, because I'm not that good on Syria. So some of you in the audience may know more than I do. There was the American Cultural Center and the American Community School in Damascus that were closed. And what I'm curious to find out is how they've been reopened, because I kind of took it for granted that after Syria had made a statement about saying, we're not going to let ourselves be culturally imperialized by the United States, they'd allow them to reopen. And so I don't know about that. Naturally, whenever anything happens to Syria, there are 2 things that I immediately think about. One is Lebanon, the other is Iran, because Syria to some extent is somebody we can get at when we can't get at the Iranians. And we always worry about what if our relations with Syria aren't too good, what does this mean Syria will do in Lebanon? And that I'll defer to the others. Yeah.
Okay.
You've been there.
I was actually in Syria in May. I think that the Abu Kamal raid can be linked to the raids that are made in Pakistan, and they're an expression of the Bush administration's disregard for international law. We know that the president signed a I don't know what you would call it. It's some sort of document that ostensibly makes it legal, at least from American perspective, for American forces to go into these countries. This is not the same as a sort of hot pursuit strategy that was used in Vietnam, in that they're working on intelligence about who might be across the border or what have you, and often that intelligence is faulty. In any regard, the behavior of the Bush administration in making these raids essentially is an extension of the neoconservative concept or theory of that justifies preemptive strikes and so-called preventative wars. And these policies are quite similar, I think, to the policies of the Israelis, which are our chief allies in the Middle East. In both cases, the case of our raids across borders and the case of the Israelis, the result is almost always the death of civilian non-combatants. It's interesting that for the Bush administration, the tactic of preemptive strikes marks the sabotaging of the system of state sovereignty that has characterized international relations since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. I mean, so what we have here is the undermining of a tradition that structured international relations for what? 360 years by people who call themselves conservative. I mean, I don't know if you know much about classical conservative sort of outlook on things, but I mean, this is really just amazingly counterintuitive for conservatives. But that just goes to prove that neoconservatives are not your ordinary type of conservative. In any case, maintaining such practices as preemptive strikes within the Middle East, at least in my opinion, will not solve the region's problems. It will not stop terrorism by Al-Qaeda or associated organizations. It will not induce other states to cooperate with the United States, but it will contribute to greater chaos and violence in the region. It will alienate ever greater numbers of Arabs and Muslims from America, and it will certainly serve as an open invitation to revenge and counterattack against American personnel and property. Therefore, I think these raids are a dead-end tactic that reflect a rather simplistic strategy and rather lack of knowledge of the region and what's to be expected in the region. It hasn't worked in the past. I don't think it's going to work in the present.
Well, I guess I'll pick up on the comments made by two colleagues. First, in terms of neoconservatism, and I talk a bit about that in one of my classes, Turbulence in World Politics. Yes, there has been this split between neoconservatives and traditional realists, and this is a split that even exists within the Republican Party on how to conduct foreign policy. Realists are very cautious in the use of and exercise of power. Neoconservatives are a bit more aggressive. The basic doctrine behind neoconservatism is that the United States has an historic opportunity to, if you will, change the world and bring the world in America's, remake the world in America's image. So there is a certain amount of unilateralism that is involved in these operations. I have to say I generally agree. This is a major attack on the institution of sovereignty. The argument that's being made, those who would support an operation like this is, quote, you are sovereign if you are able to control the territory that you are ostensibly in control of. Meaning that if there are certain weak states that exist around the world, those weak states become, if you will, they attract a number of radicals from around the world. Thus, it is important for the United States to go in and defeat various what the U.S. would call criminal elements or international criminal elements. So it's part of, so they're attacking sovereignty by saying that these states are not fully exercising sovereignty, that is, full control over their territory. Thus, I do see a similarity and a linkage between what the United States has done in Syria and also what the United States has done inside Pakistan, particularly in the federally administered tribal areas, which supposedly have offered sanctuary to Al-Qaeda. I also have to, I generally agree with what will happen if the United States continues operations like this, in the sense that there will be a blowback inside the region. These types of actions, yes, they do lead to civilian casualties. This leads to a sense of reaction inside the region. And also, it goes to, I would say, the geopolitical struggle that is going on inside the region, where the United States, again, is trying to remake the region, trying to order it in a certain way. And then you have differences with some of the key actors. And again, let's take Syria. Syria is in a very precarious situation. You can take a look at Syrian geopolitics. They have a situation like Lebanon. Syria have always believed that they had a special relationship with Lebanon. A number of members of the ruling family inside Syria have ties inside Lebanon. And over the past 3 years, the Syrians have been pressured inside that country. They've been pushed to perhaps scale back some of their operations there. So Syria is tied down in Lebanon. They wish to maintain ties because they are profitable. So if they cut off they're harmed. Then they have the Americans to the east. And then the Israelis still controlling the Golan Heights. So the Syrians feel a bit constrained. In terms of what American policy should be there, I would say American policy should be one of trying to, if you will, wean the Syrians away from the Iranians. I don't believe an operation like this contributes to that, but it is part of an overall strategy that perhaps America might pursue. Indeed, the Israelis have attempted to pursue such a policy of weaning the Syrians away from the Iranians. The Israelis, at least until the latest political turmoil and elections are not scheduled in Israel, until that time there was a talk of reopening the Golan Heights negotiations with the Syrians. That might be something that that could wean Syria away from Iran as part of an overall peace negotiation. And that's all I'll do.
We have a little time to spare, so if anybody would like to follow on.
The only one thing I should have said, somebody's got to say, but unfortunately I forgot the name of the man I want to identify, is the U.S. was going into Abu Kamal specifically to take out a net of terrorists who were tied to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So the official justification had to do with it, but we're only going in, we're going to kill these guys or capture them, and that's all we're going to do. The fact that several civilians, including children, got killed wasn't part of the game plan. But it was tied in with the American presence in Iraq, and that ought to be done.
Yeah, and I guess I should say the notion that of the United States, as you correctly put it, remaking the Middle East, is such a phenomenal act of hubris that only people who have no knowledge and are ideologically, constricted and have this sort of ideological blinkers on, as the neoconservative element in this country does, can possibly think that this is weird. I mean, it's just fantasy.
Yeah, one more point about Syria as well. I would argue that the Syrian regime, and this goes to why the U.S. fits business. I would say the Syrian regime is one that is operating out of if you will, a basement of fear, meaning that the Syrians fear that their regime may be in trouble. Thus, intensifying this type of pressure on the regime may not get the type of reaction that the Americans want. It is very important to understand what type of actor you're dealing with if you engage in any type of operation.
Second question is, the UN mandate status of forces agreement. Now, I wrote this at the time a couple of weeks ago. So set to expire at the end of this year. What will be the U.S.'s role in Iraq? As there has been a draft that's been circulating around, and it went before the Parliament recently. So it appears to be going into the final stages of becoming active. What do you think of that?
You want to say?
Yes.
As I think almost everyone in the room knows, the Iraqi cabinet has accepted an accord with the United States that provides for the certain withdrawal of American troops by the end of 2011. Whether it really happened, or obviously none of us can foretell. There are several things that could happen that we won't be terribly thrilled with, one of which is that the Iraqi parliament may not ratify this accord, and therefore it may become a dead letter. The whole thing will have to be renegotiated. In the meantime, the UN says the forces agreement will have, or the UN resolution that authorizes us to be there will expire, and we've had a lot of difficulty in negotiating directly with Iraq. Also, a matter I'm a little bit uncertain about, and I think almost everybody can help me with this. If this was a treaty, we'd have to have our Senate ratify it. Nobody's mentioned this, so I don't think it's not a treaty. It's called something else, and therefore the constitutional provision doesn't apply. But that needless to say, if large sectors of the American public are not happy with this agreement, it's going to be rather one of these things we'll try to get around as much as we possibly can. At some point or other, we need to sort of line out just what are America's interests in having an occupying army in Iraq for such a long time. My own suspicion is not so much oil, although that certainly could never be omitted, but rather that the presence of American troops in Iraq provides the basis for possibly future intervention either against Iran, which would seem probable, or against Syria, which of course the previous discussion brought up. And they also indirectly provide a force that's supportive of certain elements of the Saudi government, or perhaps possibly the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I also think that American interest in defending Israel, or at least making sure Israel can defend itself, is partly tied up with the reason why we went into Iraq in the first place and have stayed in Iraq so long, and I think are likely to stay in Iraq for quite a while longer, regardless of who is president. That's much I want to say about that. Very much
Okay. Well, technically, legally, without a bilateral agreement with the Iraqi government, the Maliki government, or the renewal of the UN resolution, there will be no legal status for the presence of U.S. forces in Iraq. But of course, I think you have to keep in mind that the entire Bush foreign policy is based on the defiance of international law, so that the result would not be, I don't believe, our evacuation from Iraq, at least under the Bush administration. However, as Dr. Goldschmidt noted, the latest reports are that Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki has agreed to push the agreement, that the cabinet is overwhelmingly supports the agreement with the Americans, and as important, the Iranians seem to have ceased their opposition to the latest draft of the agreement. So it looks good that there will be this sort of status of forces agreement between the two countries. Looking towards the near future, President-elect Obama claims that he will draw down American forces from Iran and evacuate them by 2010, or sometime in 2010 at least. And I would suggest that he would be very wise to do this, simply because, at least in my opinion, our position in Iraq is really untenable. Whatever we were trying to do there, assuming that our object was not just a simple destruction of the country, which it might have been, I don't know, but any other objective seems to be not achievable. Our being there destabilizes regimes in the region that otherwise cooperate with us, and generally, as Osama bin Laden never ceases to point out, our presence there serves the interests of these organizations. So in essence, if you ask me, the U.S. has no future role in Iraq. It simply has no role there. And so what we really need to do is create a very large escrow account, which then can be used by the government of Iraq to rebuild what we have unnecessarily destroyed. But what we have created in Iraq is the future of a Shiite government, which will dominate that country and settle scores rather bloodily with the Sunnis. The Kurds, I think, are doomed. They'll be caught between the Shiites. I mean, I'm not advocating this, obviously, but it seems the fate of the Kurds in their to be doomed in all things. They'll be caught, I think, between the Shiites to the south, the Iranians to the east, and the Turks to the north, and this is the Kurds. It's unfortunate. So we have created an environment where there will be a future Shiite government in Iraq, and the most influential foreign nation in that country will be Iran.
Well, in terms of the status of forces agreement, I would say that the biggest development in it is it calls for the United States to get Iraqi permission for raids in Iraqi cities. So a large part of this is getting the U.S. out of Iraqi cities, which is a major political problem for the Iraqi government. It weakens the sense of legitimacy that exists in the Iraqi government if you have Americans raiding their cities. So I believe that's probably the biggest immediate impact. Although American forces are to withdraw by 2011, this provision about the Iraqi cities is supposed to be implemented by sometime next year.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is, in fact, I would say, the biggest impact. In terms of what U.S. role may exist inside Iraq, I believe the position of the Bush administration, we'll see whether or not the Obama administration agrees with it, is that Iraq serves as, yes, a base of operations for the United States. There are currently, let's see, and this goes back actually to the previous question, there are about 15,000 American Special Forces spread around the world, but mostly concentrated inside the Middle East. Many of those forces may be concentrated inside Iraq for a quick reaction against supposed criminal elements that may exist throughout the region. So what is the long-term U.S. situation inside Iraq? If the U.S. is able to continue this, it is for Iraq to serve as a base of operations. What may complicate that is the Iraqi politics. And in terms of Iraqi politics, you have to look at not only the divides among the Kurds, the Sunni and the Shia, but also divisions within them. In terms of the Shia, you have what, I guess from American perspective, the more moderate Shia group, and then you have a group headed up by Muqtada al-Sadr, who is strongly against this agreement, by the way. And even that is somewhat complicated because Muqtada al-Sadr has somewhat a rival relationship with another Shia militia group that is even more firmly backed by the Iranians. So that's the reason why Iran is the critical actor in this entire process. Iran is, in many ways, the natural leader of the Gulf region. If you take a look at the map, Iran has always been the dominant country inside that area. Prior to the fall of the Shah, the United States sent billions of dollars to Iran so that Iran would guarantee security in that area. There are 70 million Iranians versus only, 25 million Iraqis, 25 million Saudis. So Iran is clearly the dominant actor. And actually I'm sort of presupposing the next question as well in terms of any type of direct negotiations. If the United States wants to have stability inside Iraq, Iran must be a participant in those negotiations. Just as the Turks must be alerted to whatever happens with the Kurds. Yes, I agree with you. The Kurds, so far away from God and so close to Turkey or so close to Iran, wherever the case may be. It's the largest nation in the world without a state of their own. The Kurds actually is the one group that would like the Americans to stay, because as long as the Americans are there, the Kurds have the de facto independent state. So if the Americans withdraw, they're the ones who will be hurt the worst. In terms of the American occupation inside Iraq, in the beginning it was the Sunni that were most strongly against the Americans, because the Sunni were the ones who had the power inside Iraq for many years. The Americans crushed their power base. Therefore, it was the Sunni who largely went against the U.S. But over time, many Sunni have come to view the U.S. as perhaps their protector against Shia domination. Thus, many of the Shia groups, the divisions within the Shia, those who perhaps would want to work with the U.S. in order to establish a stable Iraqi regime, and those who want the Americans out. There are differences in terms of how religious a regime they would want to set up. So looking at what America's role will be in Iraq, I would say we have to look at domestic politics inside Iraq. Who are the various actors there who would be pushing for one type of policy or another? But again, going back to my original point, the biggest change that we should see is reduction in American forces operating in Iraqi cities. And I cannot overemphasize that enough, because that's critical for the Iraqi regime to try to reestablish some of its credibility with their people.
We have about 1 or 2 minutes for
A possible danger with this is that we might very well vacate Baghdad, Mosul, Basra, etc. But our really major bases, the ones that we were hoping to have permanently, are out in the countryside in particular. They tend to be in the parts of Iraq closest to either Iran or Syria, because that's the real purpose for our having the base in the first place. And those are the ones that I'm guessing, even an Obama administration, in spite of Obama's protestations or professions of opposition to U.S. presence, are going to last.
I can't see it. I can't see it. By 2011, there are no more. The only Americans in Iraq are the ones who are going to be protecting the embassy.
On this one, difficult to say. It would not surprise me if the Obama administration says that there may be a need to maintain a small level of American forces. I don't know what that number will be exactly, but a small number of American forces to provide additional training for the Iraqi military. Also, some of these special forces operations. So we're talking about a force of perhaps 15,000 or so. But the bulk of American forces will be drawn down.
I mean, what are the Iranians going to say about that? I mean, we're going to have a Shiite government. That Shiite government is going to be basically Islamist, right? Our party or what, Sistani and the rest of it, basically Islamist. There's going to be no special forces in Iraq. I just don't know that they would let them do that.
This leads us into our third question. President-elect Obama states that he will use tough direct diplomacy to deal with nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea. How effective do you think his new approach to Iran will be?
Iran has a long history of bending when it must against foreign pressure, but quietly subverting it from underneath. And so I really have, I mean, they sound good in an American presidential campaign to talk about talking tough to Tehran or indeed to Pyongyang. I think the reality is that these are methods that are almost bound to fail. They're bound to create resentment and make it harder for the Americans to achieve any of the objectives they might really have. I also need to have it proved to me that Iran really is developing nuclear weapons. Suppose Iran did have a nuclear weapon. What would it do with it? Israel has far more nuclear weapons than Iran is ever likely to be able to develop. And if Iran were to try to use its nuclear weapons directly, the Israelis would be able to retaliate in a far meaner and braver way. What I think is a danger is that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, and I doubt that it will, that it would tempt the Saudis, the Egyptians, and other Middle Eastern actors also to get into the nuclear game. But anyway, I think that the kind of diplomacy that needs to be used with Iran is far more one of quiet talking, with minimum publicity, low level for as long as possible, and not always shouting.
I basically agree with this. I mean, they tell me that, or I read that President-elect Obama is reading biographies of Abraham Lincoln. I imagine that's for domestic insight, but if he tries to treat Iran like the Confederacy, we're all in big trouble. You know, as far as foreign policy goes, again, I think that I'm not encouraged by the people around who surround Mr. Obama. I think he's not talking to the right people. He's certainly not talking to the three of us. So he did originally pledge to go into negotiations with Iran without preconditions, and then in his first post-election news conference, he said that, you know, he came out and he said, well, no, we can't let Iran have nuclear weapons, we can't let them support, quote, terrorism, unquote, all that kind of business. That, I hope, it was for domestic consumption, for, part of this Lincoln-esque strategy of bringing in your opposition to be close to you so that you can co-opt them, disarm them, and what have you. Because if you approach the Iranians as Bush has approached the Iranians with the positions that essentially predetermine the outcome of any negotiation, it ain't going to work. They're not going to do that. And it doesn't matter whether Ahmadinejad is president of that country or somebody else is. They're not going to react to this. On the other hand, I think that Dr. Goldschmidt is absolutely correct. The Iranians are willing to compromise if the price is right and the approach is respectful. They have approached the United States several times in the recent past, seeking some accommodation, and the Bush administration has rejected them, which was a big mistake. Threatening them with sanctions is just a disaster. I mean, the notion of, well, what's Mr. Obama going to do? Impose sanctions on, or try to impose sanctions on Iran as impose sanctions on Iraq. Those sanctions were draconian and constituted essentially a war crime as far as I'm concerned. Does he think that Iran can't complicate his life in Afghanistan if he actually really means to pursue the war in Afghanistan? Does he think that Iran's going to cease its support of Hezbollah under threat? This is simply not going to happen. I think we have to understand that Barack Obama doesn't know anything about Iran. He doesn't know anything about Iranians. And The only difference is that he, unlike George W. Bush, Obama is smart enough to know he doesn't know anything. And he's smart enough to know that the ignorance is important, is matters, okay? So, so then what we have to watch is who he talks to, who he gets to advise him about Iran. And I certainly hope he goes beyond Rahm Emanuel, who's not going to give him much good advice on this topic. So so how Mr. Obama approaches Iran is going to be one of the early signals, I think, of just how smart our new president is. And he's supposed to be a very smart man. If he goes forward with unreasonable preconditions and threats and sanctions, he's going to really squander at least the foreign policy aspect of his mandate. And he's going to position himself, I hate to say this, as the first African-American president to act like a foolish white president. He doesn't want to do that. Okay. Sorry.
Well, in terms of Iran, I guess I'll start off by saying that, declare a statement. Sanctions do not work. And the reason why sanctions do not work is because, well, what is the purpose of sanctions? The purpose of sanctions is to impose costs on the population of the country you're sanctioning. The people feel those costs, feel the punishment, and supposedly they would go to their leaders and say, please change your policy so that that other country will stop sanctioning us. Quite often what happens is that the people who are being sanctioned get upset with the country that's sanctioning them. So generally sanctions do not work. So we can put that part aside. In terms of Iran, we have to ask ourselves, is Iran basically an opportunist or a reciprocator? An opportunist is a country that would take advantage of any type of niceness or accommodation that you happen to make, whereas reciprocators are those that will react how you act. So if you want to act tough with a reciprocator, they will act tough back, and you may end up having a conflict that you could have avoided. So the first thing, this is uncertainty that we're dealing with, and we have to decide what type of regime are we dealing with inside Iran. And what makes things a bit more complicated is that Iran is a complex society. There is no Iranian monolith. Quite often we hear about, yes, the Islamic Republic of Iran as though they're all the same. No, there are those who are a bit more hardline inside Iran, and then there are those who are a bit more accommodationist inside Iran, people we can kind of deal with. Indeed, one could argue that it was the failure of the United States to kind of deal with the Iranians, or at least to speak with them, during the time of President Khatami's administration in Tehran, that perhaps contributed to the reaction and the rise of Ahmadinejad inside the country. Not that American policy determines Iranian domestic politics, no, but it may be a contributing factor. So I believe it is important for the United States to have some type of engagement with Iran, given the critical nature of that country. Once again, look at the map, look at the geopolitics. Any type of discussion dealing with the Middle East and Middle East security and security in the Gulf must involve the Iranians in some type of way. In regards to the issue of, diplomacy, I guess this is all part of the nuclear issue. Why do countries try to acquire nuclear weapons? Well, one of the reasons they do is because they feel threatened. And we know that countries that are at a disadvantage in conventional forces will try to acquire nuclear weapons in order to balance things out a bit. The Iranians clearly saw a demonstration of American military power next door inside Iraq. And to the extent that the Bush administration said there's the axis of evil. Iraq, Iran, North Korea. Well, let's see, who's next on the list? So
we get invaded. The one with the nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Precisely. You acquire nuclear weapons in order to deter another country with a conventional force advantage from attacking you. Now, the problem that the Iranians are facing, and there have been some studies on this, when a country attempts to acquire nuclear weapons, the likelihood of their being attacked goes up until the point that they actually acquire. Once they acquire, then the likelihood of their being attacked goes down. It goes down to the floor. So Iran is now in a dangerous period where perhaps they're trying to acquire such weapons that can yield them security in the future, but they have to traverse this very dangerous period right now. Is it possible to come to some type of agreement with the Iranians in terms of maintaining stability in the Gulf region? I believe that is possible, at least with some groups inside Iran. Once again, in terms of what I said about Iran and what the status of domestic actors would be, we have to look at what the status of domestic actors will be inside Iran. Who are the ones who will be in charge? One thing that has not been mentioned is the price of oil. The Iranian budget is set up in a way where, for all intents and purposes, the price of a barrel of oil must be $90 in order for Iran to make its budget, in order to fulfill its budgetary obligation. Well, the price of oil is now below $60. Iran is in trouble right now. They're in trouble. So this is a time when the Iranians may be a bit cautious about having outside adventures because they may not be able to afford them. So it may be possible to cut some type of deal with the Iranians, if not with this particular regime, perhaps with the next regime that may emerge, because there is some doubt that Ahmadinejad may be reelected. He may be the first Iranian president since the Iranian Revolution not to be reelected because of the collapse of oil prices. His regime is in trouble. It's not American forces that destabilize and replace regimes, it's oil prices. Economics has to be a large factor here. So I agree with this notion of diplomacy and talking. It's the only way to try and bring about stability inside the region.
We should also keep in mind that although presidents come and presidents go in the Islamic Republic of Iran, one of the characters we have to watch carefully is the supreme spiritual leader, Khamenei, who probably isn't very bright, but certainly has a lot of power behind it. Even though a great many Iranians are dissatisfied with the structure of the Islamic Republic and might prefer something a little bit more liberal and democratic, he or people like him are likely to continue to exert real power in the military and in the government.
Any others? The fourth question is, how do you foresee the Israeli elections playing out in February now that the U.S. elections have been over?
Well, I guess there are three groups that we want to look at. The Labor Party, but the Labor Party has become quite weak during the period of the coalition government that's now in charge in Israel, and it's very likely that Labor is going to lose seats in the Knesset in the next election. There's the Kadimah Party, the party of Olmert. Olmert himself has been prime minister. He's somewhat discredited with his indictment hanging over his head. But his foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, appears to have some popularity and may actually end up being able to draw votes in the February election. And there's the character which most experts on Israel think is most likely to win, the leader of the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was prime minister in the 1990s and is regarded as generally kind of hard-ass. But he also has been known to knuckle under to certain types of American pressure. The Clinton administration was able to get him to agree to a compromise deal on Hebron, which I don't think worked very well in the end, but at least it started out okay, and the Wye River Accords of 1998. And it's conceivable that he might be willing to cut a deal with Syria, but this is highly speculative, and I really think I better defer to the others.
Well, if the question implies some sort of influence on the part of the American results of the American election on the probable outcome of the Israeli election, I don't think that that it's going to work that way. Certainly not, in my opinion, going to moderate the positions of the Israeli leaders. In fact, if there's any influence, any minor influence on the Israeli electorate, but as far as the outcome of American elections, is probably to move at least some of the Israelis to the right, not to the left. In any case, I think, from my perspective, the difference between the contenders, Livni, as far as the Kadima party, and Netanyahu for Likud, the difference between these two is tactical, not strategic. Both of them really oppose a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Netanyahu said so up front, and he will not put much energy into any sham negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas. Livni, on the other hand, will probably carry on the traditional Israeli policy of endless negotiations designed to go nowhere, while Israel simply continues its illegal colonization of the West Bank. So the real question, in my mind, is whether President-elect Obama has the political backbone to somehow defy the Zionist lobby in the United States and put meaningful pressure on the Israelis to stop their illegal behavior. I hate to say this because we all know that sanctions don't work, but I'd love to see an American president try them against Israel. There is, of course, an enormous domestic political cost to this type of behavior. We are not a democracy of individuals. We are, in fact, a democracy of competing interest groups. And in terms of foreign policy, as directed to the Middle East, we all know that the most powerful interest group in this country are the Zionists, both Christian and Jewish. They control the behavior of the Congress on this issue. They control the positioning of the political parties, both Republican and Democrat, on this issue. And at least since Kennedy, they've controlled the executive office and its policy making on this issue. So, we can ask what are the probabilities of Mr. Obama actually working to defy them. One can hope against hope for this, but I don't know.
Well, I believe that the Israeli elections may be critical. There are differences between the current governing coalition, Kadima and Labor, being a bit more accommodation in the sense of engaging in negotiations, and Likud and Moladet and many other parties to the right strongly opposed and wishing to maintain the occupation indefinitely. If I was to forecast, I would say yes, Netanyahu is in a pretty strong position in terms of the upcoming Israeli elections, and probably the fact that makes me say that the most is the fact that there's been something on the order of about 800 plus rocket attacks coming in from Gaza into Israel, forcing the partial depopulation of an Israeli town, Sderot. Why do I bring that up? Because for many Israeli hardliners, and the Likud party is the hardline party, Likud and its allies, Moladet, etc., inside Israel, the position of hardliners happen to be that we cannot engage in any negotiations, we cannot move to end the occupation, because to do so would lead to the vulnerability of the state of Israel, and also the extremists on the other side will continue to attack us, whether we negotiate or not. So those who are slightly more accommodationist, if you will, than the hardliners, they're in a very tough position right now. Indeed, one could say that there could be a working relationship somewhat between, say, Hamas and Likud in terms of keeping the conflict going. Clear hardliners on the Israeli side, Likud, wish to maintain the occupation. Those who take a more hardline position on the Palestinian side, they would be opposed to a two-state solution that leaves the Palestinians in a what some would call a Bantustan type of setup. So you have the electorate doesn't look very favorable right now for more accommodationist and more moderate emerging on the two sides. The situation inside Gaza concerns me a great deal. I believe it will have a major influence on how Israeli voters react and what they will be thinking about when they go to the polls. In terms of what Obama will do, my guess is that Obama will try to restart what the Clinton administration ended with back in 2000. That is something on the lines of a Camp David II, something on the lines of a peace deal where the Israelis would withdraw from anywhere between 85 to 95% of the West Bank. The question is, how much compensation will the Palestinians have? So that's sort of the broad outlines of some type of agreement. The question is, one, does Obama have the political capital to move forward on that? One. Two, do the Israeli, if you will, accommodations or Israeli moderates, do they have the political capital to move forward on this? Or will they lose out in the elections in February? And third, on the Palestinian side, there are two governments in Palestine right now. It's split. So who will be doing the negotiating? Will there be a national unity government that will emerge, or what? So there are a number of questions here that make it still somewhat problematic that major progress can be made on the peacemaking front. Two other stats I would like to bring up. This one on the Palestinian side, just as I mentioned about the 800 attacks coming in from, rocket attacks coming in from Gaza. On the Palestinian side, Palestinians will make this argument. In 1993, at the start of the Oslo peace process, there were about 250,000 settlers on the West Bank. At the start of the peace process, as of the mid-2000s, 450,000 settlers on the West Bank. This is a peace process that is supposed to end the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and the number of settlers have nearly doubled. So there's quite a bit of frustration on the Palestinian side in terms of continued occupation, on the Israeli side in terms of the attacks. It doesn't look too good. It would take major courage on the part of all actors to move this thing forward.
I would just like to say that, you know, in May of this year, I was in Damascus, and I talked to the Hamas, the contingent there. They do not see themselves in any de facto alliance with the Israeli right wing. Their position is essentially is a historical judgment that negotiations with the Israelis have always essentially been a cover for the creation of facts on the ground. That the Israelis respond to nothing but you know, pressure, but fighting. And so their position is that resistance is legal and resistance will be maintained. The problem for them, of course, is that they can't generate sufficient resistance to change Israeli policy, which is a problem for them. Anyway, they don't see any alternative to this. So really, it's the United States that holds the keys to this. Now, we've got the next question about the position of the United States as moderator. But this will not end until there's an American president with the political courage and the will to essentially put pressure on the Israelis to negotiate in true fashion, and not to use negotiations as a sort of cover for creating factions.
My comment about the de facto alliance but it goes to the point that, to the extent that there is this resistance, and Hamas is more likely to engage in a higher level of resistance than say Fatah. To the extent that such resistance exists, it is that resistance that may encourage more Israeli voters to vote for Likud.
In the past.
Yes, and see that's what makes this such a difficult conflict to resolve. On the one hand, there's a need to increase the cost of occupation in order to end it, yet in trying to increase the cost of occupation, it leads to Israeli voters voting for the very parties that are opposed to occupation.
Right.
Thus the spiral continues.
The problem here is that the end goal of at least the Israeli right is in fact the total ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. No? And so if you give the right that kind of political message that they can bring to the Israeli people, that they can never be safe unless the Palestinians are cleansed, I mean, then you've got sort of a popular backing for this ethnic cleansing, which can be rationalized as defensive, protecting yourself, when in fact it's ideological and produces the kind of resistance that against which you claim you need to be defended. So this is sort of a very, very vicious circle. And if you leave the Palestinians no alternative, they will not just go. They will just not lay down and say, "Here, take it." They will die. They will die fighting. And of course, there's enough of them outside of Israel that this is going to go on for a very, very long time. And we're not talking about the Armenians here. These people are much more serious about carrying this on into the future. It's not a good situation. I mean, even now, Israeli diplomats have to go around in armored cars. They'll never walk
Leading into our last question, thank you. Do you feel the U.S. is the best candidate to moderate talks between Israel and Palestine? Or would another country be better suited for this? If so, which country or countries do you think?
Any answer that I suspect any of us would give is conditional on what kind of people end up serving in the highest positions in policy making in the United States administration of Barack Obama. If indeed the pro-Israel lobby is going to remain the primary agent of the peace process, as I think it was in the Clinton administration, and certainly was in the Bush administration, then I think the United States is possibly the worst possible candidate to serve as a moderator between Israel and Palestine. And I think increasingly the Palestinians will realize this, and indeed many Israelis will realize this. In my own, based on an idealistic way of seeing things, it would be far better for the Palestinians and Israelis to quietly start negotiating on their own with minimal involvement by other countries. If there have to be other countries involved, maybe a country like Turkey, which has played something of a positive role in the Syrian-Israeli secret negotiations, would be more useful, but certainly not the United States.
It's a two-sided kind of issue. Up until now, the role the United States has played in this, quote, peace process, unquote, has been fraudulent. I mean, we're simply not the honest broker. Certainly, we are essentially allies of one side, the Israelis. Sometimes this alliance has been voluntary, as was the case with maybe the Reagan administration, certainly the Bush administration, and maybe even you could say with the Clintons. And sometimes it's been coerced, as I think it was under Carter's administration. But nonetheless, the Zionist lobby in the United States, both Christian and Jewish, has been able to essentially control the behavior of the American diplomats when it comes to this issue, and therefore, as a broker, as a peace broker, it is simply not honest. On the other hand, there is no other country in the world, Turkey, Norway, whatever, who can get the Israelis to essentially compromise, except the United States. We're the only one with the leverage. Economic leverage, military leverage, political leverage, the only one. Livni, right? Livni, the foreign minister, who's now the head of the Likud party, the Kadima party, and will run against Netanyahu, is already telling President-elect Obama not to interfere, that they don't need interference, et cetera, et cetera. The reason she's doing that is because she's afraid that, in fact, Obama will interfere in an unbiased way, all right, and put some pressure on the Israelis. That's exactly what must happen. These guys will not, the Israelis will not certainly give the Palestinians a viable state left to themselves. I mean, the power imbalance between them is enormous. And so they see there's no cost, right? They see no reason to give in. There's no cost. They got it all, right? I once talked to an Israeli military officer at a war college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Well, I'm not sure talking was the right word. We were debating, and he simply told me, he said, you know, in terms of the suicide bombings or the rocket attacks, these are acceptable costs, right? They isolate the Palestinians, they allow the right wing to get elected in Israel, they make the Palestinians look like barbarians because of the propaganda in the West. These are acceptable costs, and we'll take it, and we'll just absorb their land as we do. And so the only country in the world that can stop this is the Americans. Just like, I mean, they have to replicate Eisenhower in 56, 57 when dealing with Ben Gurion. And it's just a matter of we've got the truly revolutionary political courage to do that. Will Obama? I don't know, probably not.
Well, I have to say that the U.S. is in many ways the indispensable actor because for the comments that Professor Davidson mentioned, only the United States can put sufficient pressure on the Israelis. The last time that an administration attempts to put significant pressure on the Israelis, I guess would be the loan guarantees for housing back in 1990 during Bush 41 administration. That was the time when the administration attempted to get the peace process going, and every time Secretary of State Baker, James A. Baker, went to the Middle East, then Housing Minister Ariel Sharon put up a new settlement. It was a very
unused situation.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was probably the last time there was significant pressure. Yeah, a lot of this will, as mentioned earlier, will be contingent upon the people that Obama brings to the Oval Office. And Obama, I believe, will tread very carefully here. I do not see any revolutionary actions coming from him, largely because of his own insecurity with certain groups and interests in the United States. He does not want to appear to be revolutionary, if you will. So I believe he will move on this somewhat cautiously. If there is a model for the Obama administration, it will be the late Clinton administration with Camp David II and the Clinton bridging proposal. And what happened at that time, Clinton was pushing for the creation of a Palestinian state made up of Gaza, and again, anywhere between 85 to 95% of the West Bank, with the Israelis maintaining certain settlement blocks. So the question is, how many of those settlement blocks will be maintained? There has been, since that time, the Geneva Accords these were unofficial negotiations that were being carried out between Palestinian and Israeli officials. They got very close to the 1967 borders in terms of the West Bank. And where the 1967 borders were not followed, there was some compensation for the Palestinians. So the Israelis would give up certain land to the Palestinians. So in terms of what an overall package would look like that the United States will push, well, we already know what it will look like. The question is, who will have the political courage in order to push it? In terms of Bush 43 administration, that was the time when the administration, I would say, largely abdicated American leadership in the peace process. After September 11th, the Bush 43 administration took the position that Israel was on the front line in a war on terror. Therefore, the United States and Israel working together in order to stop terror. So there was no negotiations that were being pushed. The argument being that the Palestinians could not be trusted. Thus, the policy of the Bush administration to try to change the Palestinian Authority in terms of pushing for elections. And yes, elections were held, and Hamas won the election. So now, was it that the Palestinians voted for Hamas because they wanted to throw bombs necessarily? No. The purpose of voting for Hamas was, well, Hamas was providing public goods to the citizenry, something that Fatah wasn't doing. So we have to take a look once again at the domestic actors inside these regions and try and work with these actors in order to build a viable coalition to move forward on peace, a viable coalition on both sides. Will we see that? Again, it's questionable.
I don't know whether any of you saw this, but there was, over the weekend, there was a report out of London. It was in the Sunday Times, that's the London, Times of London Sunday edition, which said that Mr. Obama was being encouraged and was moving in the direction of supporting the Saudi peace plan, which was originally put forth in 2002, which then said that in its bare bones version, that if the Israelis went back to the Green Line at the 67 border, allowed for a viable Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, that the Arab world would make peace, that there would be trade and recognition and the rest of it. And the report said that Obama was inclined to support this. Now, immediately, Dennis Ross, it's interesting, said, oh, no. But Mr. Obama hasn't denied it, and there's been several other people who were involved, Brzezinski and Malley and others, who said, yeah, this is real. So, who knows? I mean, I'm sure that the pressures coming down on Mr. Obama on this is like tremendous. I hope he likes to play with puppies. It's a great stress relief. I know. Any others?
All right, well, we'll take a 5-minute intermission. We'll switch it up with the questions. We won't hand out note cards just in the interest of saving time. So if you have a question when we come back, raise your hand. We'll try and get in as many as we can. So take a 5-minute intermission. Thank you. And then there's about 10 minutes for each panelist to say their closing remarks. So just keep it on track. So, questions? Okay, you're back.
It's been said tonight that the way to proceed with Iran is through beginning a talk. So if this happens, how would U.S.-Israeli relations, would it be positively or negatively affected? And also, how would the perception of America be changed within the Middle East?
I believe that the U.S. and Israel have somewhat different views in terms of dealing with both Iran and then also Syria. What's interesting is that the Israelis have been engaged in some talks with the Syrians and like to further those talks, but the Americans are largely opposed to them. In the case of any type of talks with the Iranians that a new Obama administration might wish to conduct, the Israelis might be opposed to them, especially if there is a Likud government that emerges inside Israel. I don't view that as damaging the relationship significantly. There may be some tensions. It mostly has to do with what could emerge out of those talks. Any talks with the Iranians would end up bringing in, or at least discussing the role of Syria and also the role of Hezbollah. The Israelis are quite concerned about their northern border. Israel had forces in Lebanon for some let's see now, some 22 years, between 1978 and 2000. They withdrew from the south, maintained a skeletal militia force there, and had to go in again in 2006. So they're very concerned about Lebanon. And Hezbollah is, if you will, the principal conduit that Iran has on the Israel border. So what type of deal might emerge in a U.S.-Iranian talk that will have an effect on Lebanon? That's the thing that the Israelis would be most concerned about.
You know, in a way, it's rather shocking that we should be, we would regard, indeed, I think the Iranians would regard our willingness to talk with Iran as somehow an American defeat. As if there's some sign, indicated we were weak and we were incompetent, and we therefore had to talk to Iran, and this was a great concession. We maintained diplomatic relations with Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. We frequently talked with them. They talked with us. That's the way normally countries are supposed to deal with each other. I think it's really kind of pathetic that an American pressure group, or indeed some of the Iranians in exile, would be able to put such pressure on the American government not to engage in talks with Iran. However, I certainly think under the circumstances which we find ourselves, that the talks ought to start off low level and handled very quietly, and primarily focus on things of very direct concern, such as the nuclear question, and maybe only laterally get into the question of Syria and Hezbollah.
Well, Foreign Minister Livni has already made public statements that she's against any American talks with Iran. Against that, you have Mr. Obama's public commitment to enter negotiations with Iran. This was something he talked about during the campaign. Now he's tried to balance, this commitment, or try to kind of ameliorate the impact on the right that's coming against him by saying, the Iranians have to do this, they have to do that, and what have you. But there will be negotiations. There will be negotiations between the United States and the Iranians, I think that Art's right. They will begin quietly, and we'll see, again, we'll see what kind of political courage Mr. Obama has. My feeling is that he might surprise us on this. Now, on the other hand, what AIPAC and the Israeli and the Zionist lobby will do is they will probably not try to stop the negotiations altogether, that they will try to limit the results of those negotiations by working through the Congress, through maybe Emmanuel. I don't know how much leverage they have with him and what have you. And Biden will come into this too. I think Biden's the most popular. One of the interesting things talking about Hezbollah, my feeling is that the Iranians will not abandon Hezbollah because there's a religious connection there and what have you. But if you talk to ordinary Iranians, it's very interesting, and as we have. My wife is an anthropologist, and she's an Iranian expert, and she's fluent in Farsi, so when I can get the visa, they usually don't give me a visa for some reason. I mean, she carries an Iranian passport, but they won't give me a visa. Anyway, she goes, and she talks to ordinary Iranians on the streets and what have you, and what they say is, and this is quite typical, Americans would say the same thing. They say, oh, all that foreign aid we give, we've had all these troubles here in Iran. Why are they giving all this foreign money to foreigners? They should keep it here in the country, which is exactly what Americans say about the infinitesimally little amount of money, you give to all countries except, of course, the Israelis. So most Iranians would cut the Hezbollah off like that. But I don't think the government will.
Another question?
Hi. I was wondering if historically there had ever been any Palestinian leaders who advocated massive nonviolent civil disobedience as opposed to Armageddon.
Yeah, I think that the problem here is that the media, the American media, the Western media generally, do not cover what the Palestinians do, unless it's a rocket attack or a suicide bombing. I think that the media is manipulated and manipulating. The Palestinians conduct nonviolent protests, particularly against the wall, the apartheid wall, almost daily, and have been doing so for years. And there are foreigners, including Americans and Europeans, who come down, participate in these nonviolent protests, get themselves gassed, get themselves shot with rubber bullets, which aren't rubber. And in fact, just last week, one of the European, or not a European, but a British MP was injured during one of these protests. It happens all the time. And of course, the Israelis, they just shoot them.
His question had to do with Palestinians preaching nonviolence, but you can't say Elias Sattawi, or what holds my mind and I can remember things. There was a guy, for instance, who was trying to organize a relief mission for Palestinian refugees before the '67 war. It was captured by the Israelis in the '67 war, and they had great hopes for him, but the Jews were cut by love because he didn't have much legitimacy in the most Palestinians.
Right. What I'm saying is that the resistance movement in Palestine is multifaceted. Okay? And so it operates on all levels. The frustration of the situation and the long-term beating down of the Palestinians has in fact worn away any real massive support for nonviolence. but it's there. It's certainly there.
I would say during the first Intifada back in the late 1980s, there was a fair amount of nonviolent protesting going on at that particular time, and that was a period when the image of the Palestinians improved around the world. Back in the 1970s and 80s, when you mentioned Palestinians, hijacking planes and bouts of violence. And when the first Intifada occurred, particularly in the first couple of years, the face of the Palestinian resistance happened to be children. They were shopkeepers who wanted to shut their shops down as a measure of civil disobedience, not working with the Israeli authorities. Again, part of that is to increase the cost of maintaining occupation, so Israel could not use Palestinian collaborators. They had to do things themselves, which increased costs. So there have been some successes in terms of nonviolent protests. Since the first 2 years of the first Intifada, they've not been covered by the mainstream press.
All right, another question? Yeah.
What do you say that armed nuclear Iran force what we say? And what question would nuclear armed Iran affect the Middle East process? In case that happens.
First part of the question was, what real threat does nuclear armed Iran pose? And the second part?
What question would that affect the Middle East process? In case that happens.
Okay, and how that, similar to the question we had before about how will nuclear Iran affect the region? So I guess the first main question is, what is the real threat?
I don't think there is.
Well, okay, what the Americans and the Israelis are saying, and together all of us are a little bit skeptical about this, is that a nuclear armed Iran would somehow be able either to arm Hamas or Hezbollah in a way that it cannot already do, or that it would create an incentive for other Middle Eastern countries, such as Egypt or Saudi Arabia, to acquire nuclear weapons, and this would give the Israelis a certain sense of being beleaguered by Muslim nuclear powers. To me, this seems rather fantastic. I just don't believe that this is a real threat. Maybe others can speak to that.
I don't think that a nuclear-armed Iran constitutes a real threat to the world, or to the Middle East, or for that matter, to Israel. My feeling is that what the Iranians are trying to do now is to develop their enrichment technology and their supply of enrichment materials to the point where they can, if necessary, produce 2-3 small nuclear weapons. But they will not do that unless it's necessary. This is a defensive positioning they're taking. And I think that's why they want to maintain control of the enrichment process. Khamenei, the supreme spiritual leader, has put himself publicly on record saying that nuclear weapons are not something that Iran seeks or should have. It would be difficult, I think, as long as he's the supreme leader, to reverse that. But in any case, I think that given the Iranian vulnerable position, if you look at the map, Iran is literally surrounded by American bases. Right? If you look at the axis of evil and ask yourself, which one of those guys haven't been invaded? It's the one with the nuclear weapon. So I mean, they can. If I can figure this out, they can figure it out. And but I don't think that their end goal is the development of nuclear weapons, but to stage themselves technologically to do it if they need to do it. And I think it's totally and completely defensive, not offensive.
As I mentioned earlier, I believe that the Iranians are acting in the nuclear case more from a basement of fear, meaning, again, it is more defensive. The Iranians are facing a conventional weapon disadvantage, and they're using nuclear weapons as a way, or the attempt to acquire nuclear weapons as an attempt to balance those forces. Do I believe that Iran is a major threat? I guess I'll answer it this way. I am a believer in deterrence. And what I mean by that is states generally acquire nuclear weapons not to use them, but to hold out the threat that if you attack us, we can render unacceptable damage upon you. So, do I believe that there is a major threat in terms of Iran using their nuclear weapons against other countries or giving them away? No, I would say the biggest danger would be if there's a lack of command and control of nuclear weapons should Iran acquire them. That would be the threat. But outside of that, no, and Pakistan is a country that lacks strong command and control of their weapons, and we should be concerned about that country. Why do I take this view about the nuclear threat? Because of deterrence. States happen to have an address, meaning that if they use nuclear weapons, you know where the weapons came from, and you can target them. They have an address. So no, I do not view it as being a major threat as long as the United States and its allies have the ability to deter them as well.
Right. One last thing. You must understand that the Iranians are sane people. They are not crazy people. You want crazy people? Try the White House. Okay? But including Ahmadinejad here, I mean, with a big mouth and to be screwy about the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff. But basically speaking, these are sane people. They're very smart, they're very good negotiators. They're not the threat.
All right, I hate to say it, but I think we have time for one last question. All right.
The two-state solution has proven to be a home state during the British administration. How does the governor see the current administration dealing with the current situation, provided that the barrier between the people that were supposed to live side by side in this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking what we think about a one-state solution?
You know, the current administration, what this can provide for the system? What is that approach?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is that approach to the two-state solution last time was not really good. So that's a lot of the production. Yeah, thank you. Administration.
Yeah, at least in terms of American diplomatic and political elements, there's nothing there except the notion of a two-state solution, right? One-state solution is not even, in terms of their perceptions, it isn't on the map. What the best thing for the Obama administration to do is essentially do what he, if you listen to Obama's statement in front of AIPAC, which all of us got very upset about because of that statement about Jerusalem. However, if you listen to the other side of it, he said that the Palestinians need a viable, contiguous state. That's what they need, right? And so the best approach would be to essentially find a way defy the political pressure of the lobby and twist the Israeli arm very strongly, get them back to the green line. If they want to keep the area where the fence, west of the fence, then they have to compensate the Palestinians with equally rich territory, equally rich land, not mega deserts like that. But of course, that's the optimal approach. There's other things. There's East Jerusalem. There's the right of return. All of these things, and they go into the negative. It's very difficult to know how they're going to straighten all that out.
Yeah, I also say that really there's no alternative to the two-state solution. In terms of what could make things better, I would say a healthy dose of economic growth. The economic situation of the Palestinians is simply desperate. And history has shown, and there's been a number of studies that have shown that where you have desperate conditions among any people, we see a rise in extremism, a rise in violence, etc. So having economic growth, so to say two viable states. So the Palestinian state must be viable. They must have economic growth. They must provide jobs, a good livelihood for the citizens of that state. If that occurs, then perhaps a two-state solution can, in fact, work. But as Professor Davidson pointed out, in moving toward any type of peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians, and students in my Arab-Israeli conflict course know this because they're about to have a simulation. There are a number of major issues that need to be addressed. Jerusalem being one of the more vexing ones. Refugees, final borders, what to do in terms of maintaining stability in the Palestinian area. All of those issues are on the table. It would be very difficult.
What is much more likely to happen is you're going to end up with going on having one state in which the great preponderance of power is going to be held by Jewish Israelis. It's not probably what the questioner wanted, but this is what I think is most likely to happen.
You can make it really brief.
All right, just a real quick comment before I go to my question. I think somebody earlier said that we need to pull an Eisenhower supposedly to pressure the Israelis and give an example of Baker and Bush 41, how they threatened Israel money. Well, Bush 41 is the person who said that there shouldn't be a Palestinian state, because there already is one, with from Jordan. That's about as basic as you can get. As a matter of fact, Professor Noam Chomsky at MIT responded by saying, well, they can't, as an equivalent of saying, you can't be a second Jewish state, the first one being New York City. But that brings me into my question, because it seems no matter which administration you have, it's going to take a whole lot of hope to Barack Obama to, put a fair hand. And you guys all agree to saying it depends who you're surrounded with.
Right.
Well, we already saw the first who was surrounded with. So Randy Emanuel, even though his father may be a Jewish terrorist, he was into that, but he has nothing to do with it. But he does have a record, and I won't go through the record now, but you can see his on Plus for Israel. You can look at Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, who are both considered lawyers of Israel, and they seem to be on the position. So my question is, if you are advisors to the Palestinians and you see the situation and injustice for 60 years, what do you suggest? What would you do? What would you tell the president of the Palestinians? You go first. All right, while you think about it,
I don't have an answer for you.
The first thing I would suggest to them is to dump Mahmoud Abbas, get rid of him. He's a quibbling, he's bought and sold. I mean, he's bankrupt. And I tried to get Hamas to take over the West Bank. But it's all fantasy, you know? I mean, it's all fantasy. My belief is, in fact, that you have to raise the cost on the Israelis. So, how do you do that? The situation in Palestine is such that they can't do it alone. All right? It has to be outside. We have to organize a South African-style anti-Zionist campaign. There has to be divestment campaigns, boycott campaigns. There has to be somehow the American people have to come to an understanding of what this situation is costing them, particularly as our economy goes down. You know, my wife, she always goes to Washington, D.C. with the end of campaign folks to talk to the senators, congressmen. I said, forget that. Get 100 people locally and picket their offices, their local offices, so that somebody in their local offices picks up the phone, calls the congressman and says, your constituents are out here demanding or saying, this is a voting issue for me. And then you'll see them change. You'll see them change. So I think that while I don't have definitive advice for the Palestinians who are really stuck in the mud there, I mean, you know, what can you tell them? I do have advice for us, and that is they need us to help them because they can't do it themselves.
All right, with that, I'd like to move on just to our final portion. If you have a final statement, please go ahead. What would you like to say?
It's incredibly difficult for us to really come forward. Part of the problem is that the world has really sort of somewhat outgrown the system established as peace of Westphalia in 1548 with territorial nation states. And more you have what I guess we call communities of interest or objects of loyalty that somehow transcend the actual countries of the world, including, of course, those in the Middle East. And even when we talk about maybe establishing what we would call a Palestinian state, immediately we have to start thinking about the economy of such a place. And we can easily imagine, at least for the foreseeable future, that the economy of the Palestinians can be heavily dependent on the economy of Israel, whether they like it or not, whether the Israelis like it or not. What I would naturally hope we could continue to think about is whether ultimately we're not going to need to have some new form of political organization that will supersede the territorial nation state that has become so dysfunctional in terms of the modern world.
Final statement. I guess I'll use the number 7 here. In this sense, it was 11 years ago, in 1997, that I first taught the Arab-Israeli conflict course, and I remember talking with another professor who taught Arab-Israeli conflict course, and he said, "Well, this conflict should end pretty soon. It'll be over by the end of the 20th century." And if you go back to the Oslo Accords, well, it was set up so that supposedly it would end by the 20th century. Well, it hasn't. And in just thinking about this, the Arab-Israeli conflict is not about going back to Sarah and Hagar. No. The Arab-Israeli conflict is about competing nationalism. Nationalisms that emerged at the end of the 19th century. The creation of the World Zionist Organization in 1897 for the purpose of creating a state for the Jews and the Jewish diaspora. At the same time, there was a rise of Arab nationalism that occurred within the Middle East itself. So it's a competing nationalism. It is this, borrowing from title of the book, is the clash of destinies, if you will, between these two people, two nations, one land, and it remains that struggle. throughout it all. 1917, Balfour. 1947, the UN decision to partition. 1967, the Six-Day War that set up the current occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So we're still dealing with the after effects of what happened then. So will this conflict end anytime soon? Unfortunately, I do not believe so, because of the various actors and interests that remain. As I mentioned earlier, going back to cost, yes, one would argue if you want to end occupation, you have to increase the cost of occupation. But increasing the cost of occupation leads to Israeli voters voting for the hardline parties who want to maintain occupation. So again, it is that vicious circle that continues on. It will take someone of immense courage to break that cycle. And in terms of what possible solutions exist, well, we all agree. Possible solution, two-state solution, independent Palestinian states on the West Bank and Gaza, with perhaps some minor border revisions in the West Bank. But again, how do we get there? And if we do get there, what type of viability will that state have economically, so that we do not have another generation that would be talking about this conflict? So I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I am a realist.
I have an optimistic ending. When I started this business of challenging the Israelis on our home front, this was in the late 1960s when I started this. Things have really changed tremendously for the better since then. You know, in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, you couldn't talk like this. You couldn't criticize the Zionists or the Israelis without being, accused. I mean, you're still accused, but I mean, in much more vehement public way, they'd shut you down, right? But today, the issue is much more public, much more out front. It's out front on college campuses. It's out front even politically. That dance music? It's out front politically, and I think that the Zionists here in the United States and in Europe too are on the defensive. They're not on the offensive. We're on the offensive. They're on the defensive. That's a tremendous change over 20 years. So I wouldn't lose heart yet, particularly now, particularly in the diaspora here. I mean, we just have to continue supporting the Palestinians. We have to work at raising the economic, particularly the economic and social and cultural costs for the Zionists. The Zionists send out a ballet, picket the ballet. Right? The soccer team, picket the soccer team. Look at how they do it in Scotland. So it's true. They're very good in Scotland at doing this. We raise those costs. We do our bit. They hold on in the West Bank and Gaza, hopefully. And so someday maybe there will be a Palestinian state. Maybe there'll be Palestinians even there left to live in it.
Thank you guys for all coming out today. Remember, anyone interested in communication and research, talking things like that? There you go.
maybe?